So our task this morning is to consider the final part of the book of Genesis, and we will be considering especially what's often called the Joseph narrative. So we will be moving from chapter 37 to chapter 50. Again, we're unable to look at many of the details, but hopefully we will just get an overview and a sense of these chapters. And I would like us to consider this part of the book of Genesis from three overlapping angles. We will first of all consider this part of Genesis from the perspective of Joseph. And so we will trace the story of Joseph, which hopefully we know fairly well. We've seen the movie, so we know what takes place in the life of Joseph. And then we will revisit the same story, trying to give particular attention to Judah. And we will see that Judah seems to appear at various moments throughout these chapters and seems to have a significant role. And then we will finish with sometimes in groups, where we will try to link both the story of Joseph and the story of Judah to the greater story, the story of salvation. We mentioned on the first day that if we look at the detail of the book of Genesis, there are some clear markers that help us to distinguish the various sections in the book. And we noticed this term toledot, which appears about 11 times throughout the book. And this is the word that is inviting us to see that we're entering into a new section of the book. So in our Bibles, we have 50 chapters in Genesis. Originally, we have 11 chapters in Genesis, and they're marked by this word, toledot. And the word toledot is linked to the overall theme of the book. We're looking for the offspring, we're looking for the seed of the woman who will reverse the consequences of the fall. And you'll notice that once we arrive in chapter 37, we have entered the final section of the book. This is the longest section in the book, taking us from the story of the descendants of Jacob, the toledot of Jacob. So notice that the toledot of Jacob is not really about Jacob, but it's about the sons of Jacob, because the word toledot comes from the idea of the offspring. And I think it's important for us to state at the very beginning that the title of this section of the book is the toledot of Jacob. So it's not just the story of Joseph, it's a story of the sons of Jacob. And if we grasp that, we will be better positioned to understand this part of the book. So we know that if we just trace it in our Bibles, we know the story in chapter 37. We have the introduction of this son of Jacob called Joseph, and he is the beloved of the father. And because he is loved so much by the father, and because of family dynamics, his brothers are envious of him. Joseph doesn't seem to do too much to gain the favor of his brothers. He tells his father of the negative reputation of his brother. And we have left Jacob, who's well positioned in the land of Canaan. The story of Jacob and Esau finishes with Jacob well positioned in the land of Canaan, and then you have Esau who has moved east. Not left, right, who's moved east. And typically any movement towards east in the book of Genesis is a negative movement. So Cain will move east. They will move east to build the Tower of Babel. Lot will move east towards Sodom, and then Esau is moving east, while Jacob is well positioned in the Promised Land. And the overall purpose for the first readers of this section of the book is to explain how we went from having Jacob well positioned in the Promised Land and why we finished up in Egypt. And as you know, the book of Exodus begins with the people of Israel in slavery in Egypt. Now, you know the story. Joseph had this privileged position. Chapter 37, he recounts this dream to his brothers, And this dream seems to antagonize his brothers. They plot to kill him. And then Judah intervenes. And instead of killing Joseph, they sell him and he ends up in Egypt. So he's sold into slavery. Chapter 39 starts to describe the experience of Joseph in Egypt. And we discover very soon that Joseph finds favor. He finds favor in Potiphar's eyes. He finds too much favor in Potiphar's wife's eyes. She's extremely interested in him. And then he also finds favor when he ends up in prison by the keeper of the prison. And this is signaling to us that it's not just that Joseph is finding favor in the eyes of the people around him, but that the Lord's eye is upon him and he finds favor in the eyes of the Lord. In chapter 40, we read that while Joseph is in prison, he is able to interpret the dreams of two senior figures in Egypt. And this, of course, is preparing the way for Joseph to then interpret the dream of the Pharaoh. Chapter 41, Joseph transitions from being a prisoner to being the second person in charge over all of Egypt. And so he becomes the second in charge next to the Pharaoh. And he interprets this dream and he explains that there will be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. And this will be important as to explain the reason why the family of Jacob, the family of Israel, end up in Egypt. And it's also significant in reuniting again the family. Chapter 42, we have the family reunited. Because of the famine, Jacob sends his sons to Egypt. And he sends all of his sons apart from Benjamin. He didn't want to lose Benjamin, so he sends his sons, and Joseph conceals his identity. In chapter 43, again, we have that the food runs out again, the supplies run out. So again, the sons are sent down to Egypt, but this time they need to bring Benjamin with them because this had been a request of Joseph. Chapter 44 is a dramatic chapter because Benjamin is accused of stealing, and this creates great tension in the story because Joseph wants to keep Benjamin there, which will break the heart of the father. Chapter 45 to 47, Joseph reveals his identity, and Joseph provides for his family, and the full family, the family of Jacob, the family of Israel, travel down to Egypt. Chapters 48 and 49, we read of the blessings that Jacob pronounces upon all the sons, and these blessings will be crucial for the future of the nation of Israel and for the future of each tribe. And then we have the death of Jacob, and then we have this beautiful conclusion to the story in chapter 50. In chapter 50, we have the brothers who are concerned because Jacob is out of the picture, and so they think that Joseph will take revenge upon his brothers. And of course, you have this famous verse at the end of the narrative in Genesis chapter 50, where Joseph says, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." God transforms evil into good to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So Joseph is able to look back to his story, and he's able to trace the hand of God despite the suffering, despite the difficulties, despite everything that Joseph went through and the betrayal of his brothers. He's able to see that the Lord meant it for good. The intention of the brothers was for evil, but the Lord was able to transform it for good. And then chapter 50 finishes with the statement that confirms that Egypt is not the ultimate home for the family of Jacob. You'll remember at the end, we have the narration of the death of Joseph, and Joseph says, when you leave this country, bring me with you. Bring my bones, because Egypt is not our home. Now, if we consider the story from the perspective of Joseph, it's a wonderful story. And as preachers, it's our joy and our delight to invite our people to explore this story together. But perhaps we should look at the story from a different angle. After all, this is not the story of Joseph. This is the story of the sons of Jacob. This is the Toledot of Jacob. And as we have been tracing throughout the book, the purpose of the book of Genesis, on the one hand, it's to give us instruction. It's part of the Torah. So we can legitimately learn from the experiences and the reactions of Joseph. It's appropriate to use Joseph as an example of sexual purity because it's part of the Torah. It's part of God's instruction. But as we have seen throughout, this is part of a bigger story, and it's a story where we're looking for the seed of the woman. And from the very beginning of the book of Genesis, we've nearly always had only two opportunities. Is it Abel? Is it Cain? It's Seth. And then further on down the story, is it Isaac or is it Ishmael? And you have two potential candidates, and you're trying to understand, is this blessing coming through Isaac or is it coming through Ishmael? Is it coming through Jacob or is it coming from Esau? So throughout the book of Genesis, you really have only two candidates, and you're trying to trace this descendants, this offspring, the seed of the woman. When it comes to Jacob, Jacob makes life much more complicated for us because he doesn't just have two sons, he has 12 potential candidates. And in a sense, the latter part of the book of Genesis is helping us, is intriguing us. Imagine if you're reading Genesis for the first time, you're trying to understand all of these promises given in Genesis 3, the promise which is expanded in Genesis 12, that through the seed of Abraham, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Who is it coming from? And of course, the most likely candidate is the firstborn. If things go in a natural way, you would expect the firstborn to be the person that is used by God to bring this blessing. Now, I don't want to be harsh with some of these sons of Jacob, but I think it would be fairly easy to exclude from the very beginning the sons who are born not from his wives, Leah and Rachel, but the ones who are born from his servants. We have already seen that doesn't really work even in the Abraham story. I think we could also exclude the final two sons that come from Leah because they arrived a bit late into the game. And so perhaps they're not likely candidates. And so that leaves us with 6 potential candidates. And we're trying to discover where are these promises, through whom are these promises going to be fulfilled. Now, before we even enter into the Toledot of Jacob, we already discover that Reuben has been disqualified. Can anyone remember the reason why Reuben is disqualified? Yeah, he sleeps with Bilhah, with his stepmother. And so because of that, Reuben, who's the most likely candidate because he is the firstborn, he is disqualified. And then again, even before we enter into the Toledot of Jacob in chapter 34, we also understand that Simeon and Levi are to be disqualified. Can anyone remember the reason why these two brothers are disqualified? Yeah, so they take revenge for their sister, and because of that, they increase the level of antagonism between the people of Israel and then the Canaanites, and because of that, they are excluded. So that really leaves us with only three potential candidates. We have Judah, and then we have Joseph and Benjamin. Of course, we know that Jacob loved Rachel in a particular way. And so if you're a betting person at this stage in the book of Genesis, you would probably put $1 betting on one of the sons of Rachel. And of course, chapter 27, so we have three potential candidates: Judah, Joseph, and Benjamin. The Toledot of Jacob starts by putting the camera on Joseph. So chapter 37 is about Joseph, and we have this remarkable dream of Joseph that he sees that his father, his mother, his brothers will all bow down before him. Again, the character of Judah did have a small part to play in chapter 37, because essentially he was able to save Joseph's life because he suggested to sell Joseph. So he does appear onto the scene early on. And then in chapter 38, there's this, what we would consider to be a fairly bizarre story, because the camera switches from Joseph and the camera goes upon Judah. And there is a sense that Genesis is inviting us to consider these two brothers as the potential candidates. You have Joseph in chapter 37, and you have Judah in chapter 38. Now, we find Judah in chapter 38, and he doesn't really impress us too much in this first chapter. You'll remember the story. He gives his oldest son to marry Tamar. His oldest son dies, not because of Tamar, but because of his evilness. And so Judah promises the second-born. And so the second-born is given as a husband to Tamar. What happens to the second-born? He also dies. And because of that, Judah is hesitant to give his third son. I mean, if your first son marries Tamar and he dies, your second son marries Tamar and he also dies, I understand why you'd be hesitant to offer your third son. But he does offer his third son, but his third son was young, so Tamar was meant to wait for the son Shelah to become older. As the story unfolds, Judah is not faithful to his word. So Shelah becomes older, but he is not given as a husband to Tamar. And then you remember the story where Tamar dresses up as a prostitute. She covers her face. She removes her clothes as a widow. She's positioned there on the street as a prostitute. And you have Judah, who demonstrates some interest in this woman. And so, of course, they need to negotiate. And Tamar asks Judah, "What shall you give me?" Which, of course, is loaded with irony, because Tamar was meant to give his third-born. He was meant to give his son. But instead of offering his son, he is wanting to have this sexual relationship, not even relationships, sexual intercourse. It's very graphic in the way it's described. And he offers to pay with a goat. After this experience, what you have is that Judah is not able to provide immediately the goat. And so Tamar says, "You need to leave me a pledge. Give me a pledge." And you'll remember that Judah leaves his signet, his cord, and his staff. And these were guarantees that the payment will then come. So it was a deposit, it was a down payment guaranteeing the full payment. As a consequence of this sexual intercourse, Tamar is pregnant. The news spread. Judah discovers that Tamar is pregnant. He doesn't realize that he had slept with Tamar, and so his decision is that Tamar should be burnt. And what we have here is an intentional contrast between Joseph and Judah. In chapter 37, we have a deception by clothing. You'll remember that the sons of Jacob show this item of clothing to prove that Joseph is dead. And then again in chapter 38, we have this deception by clothing. The same dynamic is taking place because Tamar takes off her clothes as a widow. She covers her face, and so Judah is deceived. And then in chapter 39 is the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. And again, once again, you have deception by clothing. You'll remember that Joseph ran away so quickly that she was able to hold on to his garment. And this was the ultimate evidence that Joseph had violated Potiphar's wife. And so you see that there's an intentional contrast between Judah and Joseph. Joseph is the ultimate example, and Judah seems to be the worst possible example. Linguistically, there's a lot of words and expressions that are repeated throughout this chapter. For example, in verse 32 of chapter 37, the sons ask Jacob to please identify and to make sure that this piece of clothing is really Joseph's piece of clothing. You'll remember that when Tamar is to be burnt in order to save herself, she says that the man who has impregnated me is the man who owns this cord, who owns this staff, who owns this signet. And you have exactly the same expression. Please identify. Recognize who these items belong to. And again, in chapter 37, we also have the garment which is identified as Joseph's garment. There's also another contrast that is perhaps even stronger between Joseph and Judah, because as we know, Joseph was separated from his family, but against his will. Joseph was sold, and the text is very clear in establishing that Joseph was taken down to Egypt. Against his will, he was brought to Egypt. Chapter 38 of Genesis tells us that Judah went down towards Egypt. He left his family. He removed himself from his brothers. So whilst Joseph was a victim, he was brought away, Judah intentionally is distancing himself from the family. And of course, Judah was sexually impure, while Joseph is sexually pure. So again, if you would like to guess at this stage, who's the most likely candidate? Is it Joseph or is it Judah? As you're reading the book of Genesis for the first time, but at this stage you would exclude Judah. I mean, if Reuben has been excluded for sleeping with his stepmother, if Levi has been excluded and Simeon has been excluded, you would also think that Judah is excluded at this stage. What is interesting in Genesis chapter 38 is that once Judah realized what Tamar had done, he declares that she had been more righteous than himself, which is a remarkable declaration. This woman, his daughter-in-law, had dressed up as a prostitute, had tricked, had deceived Judah, and now Judah's verdict is that this woman has been involved in an act of righteousness, as it's then described in the New Testament. And so it seems that Judah has no real intention in bringing forward his offspring. He's already lost 2 sons, and he has yet to give his 3rd son as a husband. And so it seems as if Judah has no real intention in bringing forward his family, whilst by her deception, Tamar is preoccupied and is the means by which the family line of Judah continues. And so the careful reader will notice this detail and will understand that bringing forward the line of Judah seems to be particularly important in this story. The next time that Judah appears as a primary character is in chapter 43. This is the second time in which the family of Jacob run out of food, and so once again they need to go back down to Egypt. The great difficulty is that this time, by the request of Joseph, they need to bring Benjamin with them. And so Jacob is frustrated. And Jacob in chapter 43, he is lamenting that his sons did not deceive the person that they interacted with in Egypt. Deception was the modus operandi of this family. Everything they did was by deception. And so Jacob is frustrated that his sons had been honest and had told that there was another brother back home. And so Judah takes the responsibility. He says it's essential for us to bring Benjamin. And then he says these words, I will be a pledge for his safety. And it's the same word that was used in chapter 38 for his cord, his staff, and his signet. Remember, he left these items as a pledge, as a guarantee of the payment of the goat to Tamar. Now Judah is offering himself as a pledge for the safety of his brother Benjamin. You know the story. They travel down, and then Benjamin is tricked because the cup is placed within his bag. Because of that, Joseph demands, chapter 44, he demands that Benjamin should stay. And then there is a remarkable speech of Judah, which is more or less at the very center of the Toledot of Jacob. Chapter 44. Let's turn to chapter 44 and read from verse 18 to verse 34. Genesis 44, 18 to 34. Can I ask someone else to read this passage for us, please?
Then Judah went up to him and said, O my lord, please let your servant speak a word in my lord's ears, and let not your anger burn against your servant, for you are like Pharaoh himself. My lord asked the servant, saying, Have you a father or a brother? And we said to my lord, We have a father, an old man, and a young brother, a child in his old age. His brother is dead, and he alone is left of his mother's children, and his father loves him. Then you said to your servants, Bring him down to me, that I may set my eyes on him. We said to my lord, The boy cannot leave his father, for if he should leave his father would die. Then you said to your servants, Unless your youngest brother comes down with you, you shall not see my face again. When we went back to your servant, my father, we told him the words of my lord, and when our father said, Go again, buy us a little food, we said, We cannot go down. If our youngest brother goes with us, then we will go down. But we cannot see the man's face unless our youngest brother is with us. Then your servant, my father, said to us, You know that my wife bore me 2 sons, one left me. And I said, Surely he has been torn to pieces, and I have never seen him since. If you take this one also from me, and harm happens to him, you will bring down my gray hairs of evil to Sheol.
Okay, so I'll just interrupt you at this stage. You'll notice how he has interrupted the cycle of deceit. This is an incredibly accurate and honest description of what has taken place. Even his choice of words regarding what has taken place with Joseph is honest. You'll see that it says that he has been taken away. So he's bringing everything to light, and he's recounting all of the conversations in the most accurate possible way. He is breaking the cycle of deceit. Please continue.
Now therefore, as soon as I come to your servant my father, and the boy is not with us, Then, as his life is bound up in the boy's life, as soon as he sees that the boy is not with us, he will die, and your servants will bring down the grey hairs of your servant our father with sorrow and Sheol. For your servant became a pledge of safety for the boy to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then I shall bear the blame before my father all my life. Now therefore, please let your servant remain, instead of the boy, as a servant to my Lord, and let the boy go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? I fear to see the evil that would find my father.
Excellent, thank you. So again, you see these words, a pledge of safety. So this is the ultimate speech that unites the family. We have a fragmented family. There was a competition between Leah and Rachel, between the servant of Leah, servant of Rachel. This family was divided at the very beginning. Joseph divided from the rest of his brothers. It was a fragmented family characterized by deceit. And by this one speech, Judah is able to unite the full family. And what you have here is that you have a son of Leah who is giving himself in place of a son of Rachel. And by doing so, he is bringing together the full family. And from this moment onwards in the account, Judah takes on a leadership role within the family. So when they travel down to Egypt, who is at the front? Judah. Judah is leading his family down to Egypt. He's leading his family in the interactions with Jacob. He will then become, the tribe of Judah will then become the leading tribe among the other tribes. The tribe of Judah is the first tribe to contribute to the tabernacle. The tribe of Judah is the tribe that's to guide the people as they travel through the desert. The first judge, Othniel, comes from the tribe of Judah. Caleb, the explorer, the first one to take possession of a part of the promised land, comes from the tribe of Judah. So in a very real sense, the Joseph narrative is certainly the story of Joseph, but perhaps in a greater sense, it's the story of the redemption of Judah, who goes from being this awful character in chapter 38, who has no real thought for his family, no real thought for his offspring, to be the person who is used to unite his family. And he offers himself as a pledge of safety. He offers himself, a son of Leah, who offers himself for the son of Rachel. Now, just to complete our thinking, I mentioned the other day that I'm slightly suspicious of Joseph. I know we always see Joseph in a positive light, and of course, he has so many virtues that are displayed throughout the story. But I think it's also important to recognize some of his strange behavior. He is introduced in chapter 37 as the son that brought a bad report about his brothers. And nobody likes a telltale, so he's telling on his brothers, and that's how he is introduced. And then he has this remarkable dream, which of course then has its fulfillment, but he's very keen to share his dream with his brothers and with his father. And the reaction of Jacob would probably have been the reaction of the original reader. You know, when Jacob says, what, am I going to bow down before you? He's kind of offended by this suggestion. But more than that, I think it's important to recognize that Joseph continues the cycle of deceit within the family by concealing his identity, by accusing his brothers of being spies when he knows that they're not spies, by placing the money bag, the money back in the bags, or by placing the cup, or by intentionally asking for Benjamin. He is continuing this cycle of deceit. And the first person, the son that breaks this cycle, is Judah. At the end of the speech, in chapter 44, the very first verse of the following chapter is that Joseph is no longer able to contain himself, and so he needs to reveal his identity to his brothers. So the reason why Joseph is forced to reveal his identity is because of the power of the speech of Judah. Again, I don't want to overstate it. One day I will meet Joseph, so I'm concerned about that. But I think, it's important to understand how his story is working throughout this book. Yeah, so I would suggest that it's a story of Joseph, but also, perhaps even more so, it's a story of the redemption of Judah. And of course, both of these characters are fundamental in order to understand the greater story. We don't have time to discuss it further. We could probably spend a lot of time on this. And we don't have time really to engage with the blessing of Jacob on Judah. But just to maybe bring it full circle, I mean, here there's the issue of the lion, so the issue of kingship, of leadership. You have the final verses that seem to connect to, or Zechariah seems to refer back to these verses. And then, of course, in the Gospel of Matthew, we have that traced. But just notice the very beginning. Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies, and your father's sons shall bow down before you. If you're looking back, that has just taken place. I think this is the ultimate evidence that Joseph is a type of Christ, in the sense that the blessing for Judah and for the offspring of Judah, for the ultimate king, the Lion of Judah, is that your brothers will bow down before you. Where does that take place? It had just taken place previously when the brothers recognized Joseph. So, I think that's gives a full circle.